A guest is going to be joining us in a few minutes, and he's going to tell us all about an exhaustive study, exhaustive yet arresting, fascinating study of the influence, if you will, on something that we've all suspected in our lives. That is the corrupting influence of money in the judicial system on a state and local level across this country. Are there municipalities that actually gear their laws, gear their enforcement standards towards the almighty dollar, or as someone very wise in the media patchwork that is Rhode Island loves to say, is it in fact a dollar for a holla? We're going to tackle that in just a second. Folks, if you're a constitutionalist and you're a lover of liberty, whether you be a libertarian, whether you be a civil libertarian, if you are simply in pursuit of the truth, if you are in pursuit of a country where all are allowed to prosper, all are allowed to engage in a life filled with self-determination, all enjoy the liberties with which we all agree we were endowed with at birth, well, quite frankly, you need a toolkit. Because it's an argument that many of us are going to literally have to take to our graves. So there's a variety of resources out there in the world right now. Clearly, if you're looking for a topical publication which makes accessible both the arcane, the silly aspects of the government, yet at the same time brings home poignant issues on a day-to-day basis that affect our lives, of course, I will always talk about Reason.com, Reason Magazine. Wonderful publication, and their writers, their researchers grace the airwaves here repeatedly. But if you're looking for a think tank, I have someone to recommend tonight. And of course, I'm talking about the people mentioned in the screen right behind me, the Goldwater Institute. Why do I find the Goldwater Institute unique? You know, I'll refer to their website. The Goldwater Institute is a national leader for constitutionally limited government, respected by the left and right for its adherence to principle, but equally as important as its practical application and effective support of changes in the status quo, my words. So here's what they do that's a little bit different. There are some wonderful think tanks out there, respected thinkers, folks who can promote and discuss policy on a very high level. The Goldwater Institute does that, but they take it one step further. Think back a few years to that commercial about the national accounting firm that talked about how they could provide you with suggestions and ideas, but actually engage in the execution of those ideas? No. And that's where the Goldwater Institute differs from the rest of the pack, because they actively litigate on behalf of Americans across this country for constitutional protections. They actively research. And when I say research, folks like our next guest take it not just in the form of purely academic, which is so important, but also in forms of how it affects our daily lives. We routinely talk on the Coalition about unintended consequences. We talk about issues that are onion issues, as we like to say here, where as you peel away layer and layer, you see their profound implications across this country. And that is something that the Goldwater Institute excels at. Mr. Manley, who's their senior attorney, joined the Coalition in its prior incarnation on radio. And he spoke very effectively for about an hour on litigation that they were involved in that would force, and effectively did force, states to walk away from the type of crony capitalistic inventions that take place here in Rhode Island routinely. And of course, I'm talking about things like 38 studios. I'm talking about stadium subsidies. Where on a constitutional level, they go from state to state and force localities, municipalities, counties, state governments to adhere to their constitution. The challenge here, of course, is that Rhode Island's constitution is profoundly weak. Mr. Manley was entertaining, yet at the same time made challenging areas of constitutional law accessible. Joining us tonight is another embodiment of that principle. I'm talking about Mark Flatten. Now, Mark is an investigative journalist with about 25 plus years experience, including a stint that I'm going to ask him about at the Washington, D.C. Examiner, as well as newspapers across covering the Arizonas. He engaged in investigative journalism in areas including but not limited to the Veterans Administration, civil corruption, politics, all the things that we love here at the Coalition. So it is with a profound sense of gratitude and let's just say high-level interest and intrigue that I welcome Mark Flatten to the Coalition for the very first time. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Well, well, first of all, tell us about your background. You're very much, your origins are as a feet on the street investigative journalist. You've worked across the media landscape. How did you get involved in the media?
I went to Arizona State University, got a journalism degree. I knew when I was in high school that that's what I wanted to do. As you mentioned, I spent more than 25 years as a journalist in Arizona, largely covering state government, politics, but also doing some deep dive investigative reporting as well. I think it was about 2009, I came to work here at the Goldwater Institute. Worked here for a couple of years, and then got a call. The DC Examiner was establishing an investigative unit there at the Washington Examiner, and went out there and worked out there for about 3 years, and then I guess there are two kinds of people that go to DC, some that fall into the swamp and some that just can't stand the swamp, and I guess I fall into the latter category. I missed Arizona, and it was just a great time to come back, so I've been back here again a couple of years.
Now, we've got to ask you, as folks who are as far removed from the swamp as possible, we're libertarians and by definition in this show, and B, we're in Rhode Island, where if you wanted to talk about on a geographical, statistical, political, philosophical, moral, economic degree of relevancy, I'm not quite sure if there's a state further away from any of those goals. And I'm not sure if there's a state which is paid less attention to in DC. So what was it like at the Examiner, and how did you get involved with the VA?
The Examiner was a great place to be. Coming from Arizona, which is sort of a kind of a leave me alone kind of state, mm-hmm. And I think that's an attitude that's very strong in the West generally, but particularly in states like Arizona that have sort of this strong "I won't bother you if you don't bother me" kind of thing. To go from a culture like that to a culture like DC that is just so driven by, the politics of power, it was just it truly was culture shock. In terms of how I got involved in the VA, it was actually kind of funny. I happened to do a story on the VA. This was back when the VA was still held up as sort of a golden institution, and I happened to do a story on some excessive spending they did at a training conference, where they had all these, like silly games that were costing taxpayers, hundreds of thousands of dollars and things like that. And I started getting calls from veterans saying, yeah, that's all well and good, but you really need to start looking into things like delayed disability payments. I mean, we had veterans waiting for years to have their disability claims processed. And so I started reporting on that, and then eventually, just purely from that reporting, I started building a source network, and pretty soon people were calling me saying, yeah, the disability stuff's important, but there are also a lot of chicanery going on in the way they administer their health care program. And this was primarily veterans. I mean, this was not coming out of the political people. This was veterans calling me up who had read my stories saying, I tried to get into a VA hospital and I can't get an appointment for 6 months, or I needed to, they told me at the VA I needed to wait 8 months for a colonoscopy when I could walk in my doctor's office and get one today. And so I started looking into some of the healthcare related issues dealing with the VA. And so I did a lot of the early work on that, and eventually, not strictly from my reporting, I would not claim that, but eventually the whole sort of web of sticks came crashing down on the VA, and so I was fortunate enough to kind of be at the right place at the right time in the right circumstance, and got in very early on some of the investigative reporting that led to a lot of the reforms at the VA.
Well, it's funny, you're very modest. Shoe leather reporting, as we call it here at Coalition Radio, and which is actively employed by Kate Nagel at the mothership here at Go Local Prov, is unfortunately a dying art. In many cases, today it's media by press release. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of laziness out there in the media world. I don't think I have to tell you about that. It's probably no shock to you, no newsflash, as it will. But there's a lot of folks who essentially regurgitate media, press releases, try to spew that or spin that as journalism, because for many it would appear that the holy grail in journalism is not getting that Pulitzer Prize or not breaking that story, not being the reporting to a Ben Bradley in a hard-driven Lou Asner type press room. It's more, what can I do to get that state government, or that, better yet, that federal government, or that congressional communications job, as we were. We were saying here at the coalition, if you're not adversarial, it's advertising. So my hat's off to you, because it's those type of tips don't happen by chance. I mean, you weren't walking past a phone and the phone happened to ring and you picked it up. It happened because you had set yourself up and established yourself as a legitimate journalist who was engaged actively in ferreting out some of the darkest, dankest holes in a town filled with them. And that happens because then people develop a trust in your reporting and your writing, because it's honest. And we have that here in Providence in a handful of cases, and it seems like you're right out of that school. So my hat's off to you, because that's a type of journalism that's sorely lacking, particularly, and these are my words, not yours, in the age of Donald Trump, where positions more increasingly, and people who listen to the show know I'm no fan of Donald Trump, but increasingly positions are staked out territorially based on political philosophy, as opposed to diving after the facts. What other before we get into tonight's study, I want to spend a lot of time on that. What other issues have you worked on since you've been at Goldwater?
Oh, I've worked on, for instance, the FDA bureaucracy. One of the issues when I came back here was Goldwater's been very involved in this right to try movement across the states. And the FDA had always said, well, we don't need to reform the laws because we approve 99% of the applications we get. Well, I investigated that more deeply and found out, well, yeah, but with you do approve 99% of the applications you get, but you basically have to file your application on the top of Mount Everest. So in a country where 1 million people are dying a year, 600,000 from cancer alone, the FDA gets about 1,000 applications for this what they call compassionate use. Treatment. I've also written about what we call release time or official time, where city, state, and the federal government actually pay city employees to do union work. So I helped expose that here in Arizona. I did a big package, for instance, also on what's it take to fire a government employee. It was one of the one of the favorite leads I've ever written, which was. Several years ago, we had what were called the serial shooters, these two guys driving around town just randomly killing people, and one of them happened to be a City of Phoenix employee, and because of all of the personnel rules that were in place in the City of Phoenix, the City of Phoenix was actually not able to fire him until he had already, well, they fired him, but they were not able to complete his firing until he had actually been sentenced to death.
That is so wrong, but oh my God, it's literally the apocryphal tale come true.
That is the government personnel rules that folks were dealing with, and part of the gratification that I do get from some of this is most of these stories do lead to reforms.
Right.
Goldwater does have, it is very, that's the big difference being at Goldwater versus, most of my career being spent in a newspaper is, at a newspaper, if you expose something that is just dead wrong, you throw it out there and, maybe something will happen, maybe something won't. The beauty of Goldwater is when I expose something that's just dead wrong, we've got other people here who will take that up and develop policy recommendations or maybe bring legal challenges and actually try to correct some of these problems that I'm able to identify.
So you're I'll use an analogy here from popular culture. The Goldwater Institute is literally, you could put it into a show similar to Law and Order. The first half of the show is you out there digging the dirt up, and then we hand it over to Mr. Manley, who then prosecutes and persecutes, if you will. That's great. Without naming names, and I'm not here to belittle the work of a lot of fine institutions, but this is not an arrangement that I'm familiar with. Are there many, and I'll call them think tanks, that approach it like this?
Yeah, actually, it is, in recent years, there's been a number of organizations across the political spectrum that have started having their own, basically, investigative journalists. And I think part of the reason for that is, 15, 20 years ago, a lot of these organizations would rely on investigative reporting that was being done by newspapers to expose a lot of these problems. The problem is the newspaper industry is kind of a dying beast at this point, and investigative reporting is expensive. It's time-consuming, it's complicated, and most newspapers have kind of gotten out of that business. And so for organizations like Goldwater and other organizations that have started moving in this direction, if you want to solve problems, you kind of need somebody there to dig them out and root them out and do that legwork and identify what the problems are. So, for instance, my stories on release time. Nobody was aware of this because it was buried in these, obscure city contracts. So I was able to dig that information out doing traditional investigative reporting. And once I was able to expose the problem, the folks at Goldwater on the policy end and on the legal end were able to follow up and say, this is wrong. We should not be using taxpayer dollars to subsidize private union activity. And so that led to legal action. It led to legislative action. So that's ideally how the system works.
Right. And I've got to ask you on a personal and professional level, how gratifying is that?
Well, it's very gratifying. As I say, at newspapers, that was always a frustration, is you would expose the problem, and unless some group like Goldwater picked up on it and actually went down and lobbied the legislature and got the bills changed, or you maybe have a legislator that would take up the cause, you were essentially just kind of throwing it on the table and hoping somebody else would pick it up and run with it. Mm-hmm. At Goldwater, you know that when you expose a problem, there are people here who have expertise and ability to go in and develop legislative solutions to, if it's appropriate, to bring a lawsuit. So you know that when you expose wrongdoing and policies that are abusive towards people, that it's not just going to sit on the table, that somebody is going to pick it up and run with it.
Yeah, I've had a couple of conversations over the past year with Mr. Manley, who's your senior attorney there, and it's kind of head-spinning in one sense when he starts riffing on the number of jurisdictions that you folks are involved in nationwide across the diverse span of issues on everything from academic freedom to cronyism, similarly engaging on either an investigative reporting level, in terms of litigating. It's stunning to watch. So again, my hat's off to the Goldwater Institute because you saw a need, you saw a gap, and you guys have filled it at a very, very high level. And one can say you've improved the situation because, quite frankly, that circle of life that you so aptly discuss is really it does the trick so beautifully. So let's get to
one of the things that does fill in is a lot of sort of traditional old school think tanks will put out policy report after policy report to fix a problem that they can't identify.
Right.
So one of the things I do is sort of identify where the problem is, and then it becomes much easier to develop and ultimately pass a solution. If you're just throwing out solutions to problems you haven't identified, it becomes very difficult to make the changes that are needed.
Right. And in so many of these issues, an analogy that I'll draw that a battle that we've engaged here at the coalition on a local level for a couple of years now, of course, I'll use the analogy, which is the war on drugs. The issue that we're about to discuss has had life-changing, dramatic, both political, personal, shall we say, effect across the nation on so many levels. I'll just throw this out there. For folks who obviously, and I would say most of the nation, followed the tragedies, the drama, the violence of what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, just a few short years ago, the issue that we're going to discuss tonight is so profoundly at the heart of that our own Department of Justice actually conducted a much lesser known investigation into the implications of collusion, if you will, between the court system in America, the municipal and state level court system in America, municipal, shall we say, the constant money grab that occurs, and the impact it's had on inner city life. And I'm kind of, in a sense, thrown away. This is sort of like a Game of Thrones throwaway here in the sense I'm giving out part of the answer. But the reason I have you here tonight is not just to engage in the normal griping about, oh, those damn towns, they're pulling us over with a traffic ticket. Darn it, I mean, don't they have better things to do? Sort of right out of a Dragnet episode. The reality is the issues that we're talking about have had profound moral, financial, legal, philosophical, and life-changing implications across the entire social fabric of this country. So none of this is trivial, and none of this is, at any level, is relegated to a superficial issue, is it?
No, and in fact, what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, the project we're talking about deals with how these city courts have largely become revenue-raising tools for these cities. And you saw the consequences of that to a degree in Ferguson. Now, certainly the Michael Brown shooting was the trigger. Mm-hmm. But what the DOJ, what the Department of Justice was able to show is that in Ferguson, these city courts and, quite frankly, some of the police practices were geared specifically at raising money. And they were not meant to protect, they were not set up to protect the community. They were not there to dispense justice. There was direct pressure on the police chief and the city court system to continually generate revenue. And so if you get pulled over, let's say you run a stop sign, well, you get pulled over and they'll write you a ticket for running a stop sign and for speeding and an illegal turn and, license plate not illuminated. Yeah, they start layering these tickets on because each one of those tickets is more revenue for the city. And then when those cases would go to city court, people knew they weren't getting a fair hearing because the city court judges were answerable to the city council. They weren't answerable to the people. They were answerable, just like in Arizona and many other states, they answer to the city council. And so what that does is it breeds this distrust of the legal system. I mean, if you don't feel that you can get a fair shake in court, regardless of what level of court, you're going to lose faith in the legal system.
Right.
And that played out, I guess, in its worst consequence in Ferguson, where the community had no faith in the justice system.
Right. And that brings us to our primary issue. You've written about a 25-page or so study analysis. You published it. By the way, that can be shown, or found, I should say, and downloaded in its original form on the Coalition Radio website. If you go to today's show, there's your picture and a description, and click on the link, and you'll be able to download that when we publish the show's podcast/YouTube video. We will also attach a copy of that study. It's 25 pages. It's compelling reading. Tell us about the title and how this came to be in its analysis. How did you get a start on this?
Well, the title is City Courts, Money Pressure and Politics Make It Tough to Beat the Rap, and that's really what the story is about. And the reality is, if you ever go to court, it's probably going to be in a city court. In Arizona, and it's pretty much the same in any state, most of the court cases that go through the system are done in city courts. In Arizona, that's about 1 million cases a year. And these city court judges have a lot more power than folks, I think, realize. I mean, most people kind of view city courts as just sort of traffic courts. But these judges also have criminal jurisdiction in Arizona over misdemeanors. That means they can put you in jail for 6 months. They can fine you $2,500. They can add on all kinds of fees and surcharges. And that becomes especially problematic in that they also have primary jurisdiction over enforcement of city ordinances. And what happens is you have these city councils that will make pretty much anything a crime. And they'll make it a Class 1 misdemeanor, which in Arizona carries a penalty of 6 months in jail and $2,500 in fines. And those cases all go to city court. City ordinance violations go to city court. So just as an example of some of the things that cities in Arizona have made Class 1 or criminal violations, not all of them are Class 1 misdemeanors, but most of them are. Spitting on the sidewalk is a criminal violation in Arizona. It's actually in some cities in Arizona. Smoking in a prohibited area is a criminal offense. In some cities in Arizona, having weeds in your yard taller than 6 inches is a criminal offense in many cities in Arizona. In Mesa, Arizona, failing to return a library book is a Class 1 misdemeanor. And so you've got this dynamic where these cities have basically criminalized everything. Mm-hmm. And then those cases go to city courts where the judges are not truly independent arbiters of your case. These judges are basically city employees who are appointed by the city council. They can be fired by the city council. The city council can choose not to retain them. That can create pressure on these judges to raise money or sort of give special treatment to city insiders, or, as was found in Ferguson, to basically allow questionable practices of police and prosecutors to just kind of go unchecked. So you've created this dynamic where, on the front end, you criminalize pretty much any behavior you can think of. And on the back end, the only place to rectify that, to get a hearing on the matter, your day in court, is in front of a city employee who's going to weigh in on whether this city ordinance is appropriate. So you've created this system of justice where it really is very difficult to beat the charges. And
as we like to say here on the Coalition Radio, in the halls of justice, justice is in the halls. How big of a problem is this nationally, based on your research?
It's a huge issue nationally. In fact, if you look at the Department of Justice's Ferguson report, now we've all heard about the Department of Justice investigation into the Michael Brown shooting itself, and it cleared the police officer, found he acted legally. But the DOJ also did a second investigation, and that's one we referenced earlier, that really didn't get a lot of publicity. And they talked about, and that's the one that concluded that basically the city courts in Ferguson were just revenue-raising tools. They weren't there to protect the community. They were there to raise money. And the way they did that, aside from the question of whether that creates pressure to convict more people, but basically their enforcement technique was, if you miss a payment on a fine, or if you don't show up for court, they'll issue an arrest warrant. They'll suspend your driver's license. They use these very abusive tools primarily as a means to compel payment. And when you look at Arizona and most other states, the kinds of things that the Department of Justice talked about as abusive practices in Ferguson are routine. I mean, they're routinely used. And in fact, the Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court was appointed last year to this special nationwide study committee set up by this group called the Conference of Chief Justices or something like that. And she said, when we started out looking at this, we pretty quickly concluded that this isn't just a problem in Ferguson, this is a national problem.
Folks, if you're just joining us, this is the Coalition on the Worldwide Coalition Media Network, broadcasting live here at the Gold Local Prov Media Center at 90 Way Boston Street. Folks, you can find us at coalitionradio.us, facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the Mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course our apolitical, anti-stadium, anti-crony capitalism feed at Pawtucket is Home. Joining us is Mark Flatten. Of course, he's with the Goldwater Institute. He has issued, and these are my words on his, I believe to be a pioneering study in the dynamics and the interesting relationship now that's evolving across the country between our municipal, state, local court systems and the people who run our municipalities. The same people who are desperate, it seems, clutching forever to find new sources of revenue, seem to have found it, and it's amongst our nation's petty lawbreakers. I use that term loosely, and that probably includes, it definitely includes me, Tony. It probably includes Tony, and probably a significant part of our audience. He's talking about the criminalization of ordinary day-to-day offenses. Let's take the logical extreme for just a second. And where this criminally, this behavior, and again, we'll take the high road, and we'll call this the Law of Unintended Consequences. the life-changing impact this has on people who all of a sudden find themselves as part of the legal system and are unable to pay the fine, are unable to find a decent attorney, who are unable to defend themselves. Talk about some of the implications for what this means in their life going forward. You can get sucked into this black hole.
Well, this isn't hypothetical. This goes on every day. I mean, you go to any city court, 17 states don't have city courts, so it's, but if you go to any city court in Arizona, and you sit through a couple of days of hearings, these kinds of cases you're going to find every day, where, the typical scenario, and this is very common, is let's say somebody gets pulled over for speeding.
Mm-hmm.
So they get a speeding ticket, right? They don't have enough money to pay the ticket, so they miss a payment. Now the judge is going to suspend that person's driver's license. And if they get caught driving again, now that's a criminal offense. So that person has to make a decision. Do I risk a criminal offense, driving on a suspended license, or do I lose my job because I can't get to work now? Do I have to get my kids to school? Maybe I wasn't even notified that they suspended my driver's license because it's done automatically. So now you get pulled over for driving on a suspended license. Now you still got the underlying civil traffic ticket, but you've also got criminal charges. You're going to sit in jail until you get that resolved, most likely. And then you've also got a lot of folks who just simply can't pay it. If you get pulled over for, let's say you run a red light and speeding, you're talking about $500, $600, $700 in fines, fees, and surcharges. Because in Arizona, like many other states, the legislature has layered on all of these fees and all of these surcharges. So a $100 traffic ticket, a single $100 traffic ticket is going to cost you $300 by the time you pay everything else. And that becomes a very, very sort of oppressive. I mean, you have a lot of people in a lot of communities that just can't afford a $300 or $400 in traffic penalties, so they might miss a payment. And now that just sort of opens this whole big can of worms to where it grows from a minor traffic violation to a criminal offense. Now, if it's an ordinance violation, a criminal misdemeanor. So let's say you get caught of the heinous crime of spitting on a sidewalk in Mesa, Arizona, and you get charged with a criminal violation, which is a criminal misdemeanor, a criminal violation. Then if you miss a payment or if you miss a court date, they're going to issue an arrest warrant. And if the cops pull you over, you're going to be arrested, you're going to be taken to jail when the underlying offense itself is nothing more serious than spitting on the sidewalk. And I mean that literally. It is a crime to spit on the sidewalk in Mesa, Arizona.
Wow. So then, of course...
And not to pick on Mesa, I mean, the Institute for Justice has a case going out of Missouri in a town called Pagedale, where it is a criminal offense to have, you're required to have curtains on your windows that are neatly hung, and violation of that is a criminal offense. Having a front yard barbecue on anything but a national holiday in Pagedale is a criminal offense. I mean, it's hard not to laugh because these things are so trivial,
right,
but they are criminal offenses in city codes.
Right. And then one day you wake up and you find out that you're not insurable in terms of your automobile. That's, again, harming or eliminating your ability to earn an income. And one looks at this objectively and understands that it disproportionately affects the poor and the working poor. Folks who are middle class or are on the lower ends of the rungs of the ladder don't have a friend at City Hall that they can often call and quote unquote make it go away. They don't have access to an attorney, nor could they afford one. They don't have the ability to really challenge this, and you can see in some. It can literally turn your life upside down. So let's bring this full circle. Just like the war on drugs, just like stop and frisk, you have government out of control using our personal safety or our own well-being, protecting of such as an excuse, literally ruining people's lives, which brings us full circle back to Ferguson.
We talk in the story a lot about equal protection and due process violations, but we also talk a little bit about sort of the Fourth Amendment implications.
Right.
The courts have ruled that police can arrest you on a criminal violation. So if you get caught spitting on the sidewalk, that police officer can take you into custody. He can arrest you. He can search you. And if they find anything on your person, there were I think 10 cases out of in Maricopa County alone last year. This is one of the data points that I got for the story. 10 people were charged and booked into county jail on violations of the city smoking ordinance in Mesa. And I don't mean to pick on Mesa, but because most cities have these types of ordinances. Now, what happened in most of those, I pulled the police reports, is somebody's smoking at a bus stop. The police stop him, question him, take him into custody, search him. Maybe he's got a plastic bag with marijuana residue in it. Now they're charging him with felonies with what started as nothing more serious than smoking at a bus stop.
These are literally gateway laws.
This is used as a pretense. These ordinance violations can be used as a pretense to stop, question you, make you show ID, take you into custody, perform a search on you, and if they deem fit, to arrest you and take you to jail. So these city ordinances are being enforced. There was one individual that was the primary charge against him, was spitting on the sidewalk. Now he had other things that escalated from there, but typically what you'll see in a lot of these cases is it all starts with an arrest for one of these minor violations, and it just is something that the police will question the person and find something else they don't like at that point. But it all starts with a encounter over on one of these ordinance violations.
I'm gonna ask you a question that's kind of, it may seem it's like from left field, but folks in this country are arguably concerned about the First Amendment and its continued, I'll call it, being under siege. Part of our community obviously is very, very concerned about the Second Amendment. There's a variety of constitutional concerns out there, but from your experience at the Goldwater Institute, someone who's literally the feet on the street, I would argue that the Fourth Amendment, which of course is protection from illegal search and seizure, is literally under a vicious attack from all aspects of government at this point. And in fact, if there was an endangered species list of constitutional amendments, I would actually argue that it's the fourth. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, let's just tick down on the issues that find their way into city courts. Many cities make it a criminal offense to have certain types of signs. If your sign doesn't comply with the city code, that's a criminal violation. You can be arrested for that. So First Amendment's off the table. Second Amendment, city court judges deal with domestic violence and injunctions. If you get a domestic violence conviction or an injunction against you from one of these city court judges, who again are appointed and retained by city councils, you basically have a city department head telling you cannot buy a gun because you have an order of protection against you. I have not found any instances of them dealing with quartering of troops in your home. I believe that's the Third Amendment. But then you get to the Fourth Amendment, it's what we talked about. They criminalized so much behavior and made that a crime that you can be taken into custody for, that at some point you do not have a realistic Fourth Amendment right. I mean, if a police officer can take you into custody and search you because you spit on the sidewalk or because you have weeds in your yard taller than 6 inches, and these are not hypotheticals. People in Maricopa County, which is where Phoenix is located, have gone to jail for this kind of stuff. So they can use that as a pretense to take you into custody and search you. Clearly your Fifth Amendment is, in city court where the judges are answerable to the politicians and not to the people, are in danger. And you can just continue going on down the list.
Right. Now, underlying your report.
But again, I did not find any prohibition on quartering troops in your home.
Coming to a municipality near you.
Yeah.
Underlying, I'll call it, our discussion of your report, and this is why it's so important that folks take the time if you consider yourself a lover of liberty, if you consider yourself a civil libertarian, why it's so important to read the report. And again, we've got it up at coalitionradio.us, and of course we'll give you ample links to the Goldwater Institute where you can support them in a number of capacities, not the least of which, of course, is financial. The underlying this is the concept that there's some level of collusion, my word, not yours, between the different branches of government. Of course, what I'm talking about is the judiciary, and I use that term very loosely. Once you look at the quality of the judiciary amongst many municipalities, cities, states, a lot of these folks they're in no danger of either Harvard Law Review or a spot on the Supreme Court anytime soon. And the cooperation / collusion / enjoyment between them and the folks who run our municipalities. What can you tell us? How broad is that connection here in the country today?
Well, let me just say that this is not really an attack on the judges. What this really is an attack on the system. Mm-hmm. Because whether you've got a good judge or a bad judge, that judge needs to be insulated from political pressure. Right. And the way that our policy people are recommending that be done is to make them answer to the voters and not to the city council. So, mm-hmm. for instance, in Arizona, in Maricopa County, Superior Court judges, which are the judges that handle criminal cases, and all appeals court judges answer to the voters through what we call retention elections. So you're appointed by the governor, you serve a term, and then the voters get to decide whether you get to keep your job. Mm-hmm. Superior Court judges in other counties are directly elected by the people, but the only level of the judiciary in Arizona that does not answer to the people is city court judges. And so the idea here is not that we got good judges or bad judges, it's that whatever judge you got, he or she needs to be protected from political influence. And that really is the ultimate goal here. And the way that plays out is if you walk into that courtroom, you are entitled to true due process. That means that whether you're charged with spitting on the sidewalk or capital murder, the only thing on that judge's mind needs to be making sure you get a fair trial and that you have an honest day in court. If that judge is sitting on the bench thinking, man, the mayor's chewing me out because revenue's down, or, well, is this the mayor's brother-in-law, or, if I let this guy go, the police chief's going to call the mayor and he's going to yell at me. Anytime any of those thoughts, consciously or unconsciously, enter into that judge's head, you no longer have true due process that you're entitled to. So the idea here is, whatever political influence there is, and however susceptible that judge is, that is going to interfere with your getting a true, fair, and balanced hearing, an unbiased hearing in that judge's courtroom, which under the Constitution you're entitled to.
I'm going to paraphrase a quote directly from your study. The municipal court does not act as a neutral arbiter of the law or a check on unlawful police conduct. Instead, it uses its judicial authority as a means to compel the payment of fines and generate revenue. That pretty much sums it up, doesn't it?
That does. That's out of the Ferguson investigation that the Department of Justice did. And the Department of Justice went on to describe the practices that the courts use to essentially carry out that scheme. And the practices that they used in Ferguson are standard practices in Arizona and many other states, if not most other states. Mm-hmm. I mean, the automatic suspension of a person's driver's license if they don't show up, that's in statute in Arizona. The issuing an arrest warrant on a misdemeanor case if the person doesn't show up or even misses a single payment on a fine, that's in statute in Arizona. So you've got this whole system stacked against you at that point. And so the things they talk about in Ferguson is these abusive practices that are used to collect revenue. Those are state law in Arizona, and I would wager most other states.
Right, and it's the implications are profound. First of all, its enforcement it becomes robotic. You'll get this standard, and tell me if you've heard this before, and I'm sure most of our listeners have. Well, that's just the law. I didn't enact it. Mm-hmm. I simply enforce it. It's automatic. It's the law. I
had a number of judges tell me that. In fact, I asked the judges I interviewed. I asked them, are you there to be a check on unlawful police conduct? And most of them said, no, that's not my job. It's not my job to tell the police chief how to run his police department. So if you've got a system like they had in Ferguson of ticket quotas, many of these judges probably, well, most of the judges I talked to said it's not my job to decide whether it's right or wrong that the police department has a ticket quota. If somebody's got a problem with that, they need to call the police chief.
For folks who are...
And again, these kinds of things play out every day. I mean, the best example I can think of is the one we've all heard before. I say the light was yellow, the police officer said it was red. It's my word against his, 50-50. Who's that judge going to believe?
Right, and for folks who don't think it can happen to them, I'll just give you the result of one of the results, if you will, of our abrogated legislative session. It is now the law here in Rhode Island, signed into law by our governor, Gina Raimondo, that if you miss a parking ticket, your license cannot be renewed. Now, anyone who's dealt with the city of Providence understands that even knowing that you had a parking ticket is a challenge that you face every day when you park on the streets of Providence. You may not have. You won't find out literally until it might be too late when you go to renew your driver's license. It's that sort of robotic knee-jerk reaction that government has intentionally programmed into its systems so that it can be, again, feed the beast of government. We need more money, more money, more money. Do people even posit, or do they even pretend anymore that it's for our safety or for our good? Or are they past that at this point, in your experience?
Oh, well, the best example of that is photo radar. I mean, cities continue to insist that photo radar is just there to protect the community. And yet you look at the communities that rely heavily on photo radar, and they are the ones that have the very profitable city courts. Mm-hmm. A good example of that is this town, Paradise Valley, which is has photo radar cameras everywhere. And they raise, I think, something like 13% of their total general fund through their court, which is, most cities in Arizona raise maybe 2 or 3% through their city courts. In Paradise Valley, I think it's 13%, and it's a very heavy photo radar community. Scottsdale, Arizona is the same way. They're going to make almost as much money through their courts on photo radar as they do through all other court cases combined, and yet they continue with a straight face to insist this is not about money. This is a public safety issue.
We've only got a couple of minutes left before our break. 5 minutes before the hour, joining us, Stephen Brown from the ACLU in the next hour. But I mentioned offline when we had a brief chat, Steve Cravell last week, Colorado initiative, voter initiative, requiring. And he'll love your reaction to it, but a voter initiative requiring, in fact, that all fines be paid to charities and/or victims' compensation funds. What do you think the reaction would be in Arizona if a bill like that was submitted? Catastrophic?
As I said to you earlier, good luck getting that one passed, because that actually talks about it, points to another serious problem with this, mm-hmm. is the legislature in Arizona and these cities have layered so many fines and surcharges. They fund everything from DNA testing to clean elections, which is basically just public funds for political candidates, through these surcharges on court fines, tickets and court fines. And so if you go to court and you're acquitted, the city doesn't get a dime, the state doesn't get a dime, the county doesn't get a dime, but if you're convicted, everybody gets money. And you mentioned the ACLU. I would like to point out that when we released this report this week, we did it in a joint press conference with the ACLU of Arizona. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason for that is so many of we may come at it from a slightly different angle, but the core concern about getting true due process is fundamental to both organizations.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell us again about the Goldwater Institute and how folks listening can either participate and or support clearly your highly worthy cause. And let me just throw this in. Folks, if you don't think this can happen to you, just wait and watch, because, Mark, what's the normal retort from government? if you're not doing anything wrong, you don't have anything to worry about, do you?
Well, that's what government says, but when you criminalize everything, when spitting on the sidewalk is literally a criminal offense, everybody's doing something wrong. I will confess on public radio that I have spit on the sidewalk before, and I have been late at returning library books.
Yeah, if
and in some cities, I can go to jail for that.
right. Well, that's just between you and us and the thousands of people who will listen to podcasts.
But I would encourage people to go on the Goldwater Institute's website. My story is on there. A lot of the other work we do is on there, and if you're not interested in city courts, I'm sure we're involved in something that you will be interested in.
Right. Again, it's
because we have a whole variety of issues that we get involved in.
It's a remarkable organization. They're covering everything from crony corporatism to free speech on campus to issues like this, all of which are germane to your life. Too many times Americans in trying to get through their daily lives have a tendency to walk past issues like this until one day, that one sorry day when all of a sudden you're part of it. You become part of the story, then you are the story, and then that story becomes part of your life. So, folks, again, I want to thank Mark Flatten. Fabulous piece of investigative reporting, fabulous support for it. Folks, we'll provide the link online. Read the study, make it yours. And again, my hat's off to you and your organization, because as we like to say here, our hashtag is take it personally. Clearly, the Goldwater Institute takes it personally. Mark, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.